The St. Leonor Gallery, perched discreetly above Hanover Square, had a way of making its guests feel as though they floated rather than walked. Its tall windows, veiled in pale drapery, allowed only softened winter light to enter, turning every figure into a carefully rendered portrait. It was here, beneath the muted glow of chandeliers and the faint scent of lilies, that Lady Artemisia Vale unveiled her long-awaited exhibition. The 20 Jewels of Vermeer, a series of miniature oil portraits, each framed in modest gilt, each named after a particular gemstone. The paintings, though delicate, had drawn an immodest crowd. Collectors murmured, critics hovered. Debutantes, robed in silk and expectation, glided from frame to frame. And at the heart of the room, like a queen presiding over her private court, stood Lady Artemisia herself, tall, white-haired, and meticulously serene. But serenity, as Inspector Roderick Allain knew, was often the first mask people learned to wear. He observed from a quiet corner, invited not in his capacity as a detective, but as a friend of the arts, as Lady Artemisia had written. It amused him slightly how many of his acquaintances found it comforting to believe he shed his profession like a coat when entering polite society. In truth, he carried it lightly at all times. From his vantage point, Allain's gaze drifted over the gathering. Sir Lionel Treswick, retired general, celebrated strategist, and notorious meddler, examined one painting with military severity, as though it might confess to some breach of protocol. Near him, the sparkling young actress Celia Brandt laughed too brightly at the remarks of Jasper Herondale, a painter whose charm was matched only by his talent for courting scandal. Celia's laugh, though pleasant enough, had the brittle pitch of someone seeking approval. At the refreshment table, Lady Artemisia's nephew, Nicholas Vale, fiddled with his cufflinks as though they were coded messages. He had the air of a man who wished to be anywhere but under his aunt's critical gaze. Allain noted all this without seeming to. He accepted a glass of pale sherry from a passing waiter, nodded amiably to a minor duchess, allowed his eyes to rest, only for an instant, on the exhibition's central piece, Jewel 20, The White Star, a simple portrait of a girl in pearl-grey light. Someone behind him whispered, "That one's worth the entire collection." Another murmured, "If she dares to sell it, every museum in Europe will fight tooth and nail." Praise floated, prickling with envy. A faint discord rippled through the air. "Lady Artemisia seems unsettled," someone said. Indeed, Allain noticed that her smile, though perfectly formed, tightened whenever a guest approached too close to the final painting. She stood at a distance from it, her fingers clasped together like a woman guarding a fragile truth. Then came a small commotion at the doorway. A man in dark, travel-worn clothing had appeared, Edward Drayton, the gallery's long-serving caretaker. Unlike the waitstaff, he did not slip easily into invisibility. His face was pale, eyes shadowed, and his voice, when he spoke to Lady Artemisia, carried a weight that made nearby guests tilt their heads in subtle curiosity. "My lady," he whispered urgently, "a matter in the lower rooms. I'd be obliged if you could." She cut him off with a delicate lift of her hand. "Not now, Edward. You see the company." "But, my lady, it's—" Her look silenced him. Drayton bowed slightly and retreated. But as he turned, Allain caught a brief, strained flicker across his expression. Something unspoken, something that did not belong at a gathering devoted to beauty. Allain's instinct stirred. As the evening unfolded, polite applause for a brief speech, deliberate circulation from painting to painting, Edward Drayton lingered like a shadow at the edge of the gallery. Twice he attempted to catch Lady Artemisia's attention. Twice he failed. And twice Allain observed the tightening of the caretaker's jaw, the faint tremor in his hands, as though burdened by a message too heavy to keep and too dangerous to deliver. Then, as a quartet of guests burst into laughter near the punch bowl, a strange hush seemed to ripple beneath the surface of the gathering. Not in the air, but in Alain's consciousness. Something was wrong. Violence did not belong to this elegant world, yet he had learned long ago that elegance was the most effective camouflage it could ever wear. At precisely 9:45, the gallery's overhead lights dimmed for the lighting of the final display. Guests murmured appreciatively. Lady Artemisia stepped forward. For a moment, everything seemed beautifully ordered, but Edward Drayton was no longer at the edges of the room. He had vanished, and Alain, without knowing why, felt an echo of something cold settle at the base of his spine. Tonight, beauty was merely the frame. Something darker hid behind the canvas. The dimming of the gallery's lights should have cast the room into a hush of anticipation, yet Inspector Allen sensed a faint disturbance, the slightest tremor beneath the poised surface of the evening. Guests turned their attention to Lady Artemisia, who stood before Jewel 20, prepared to recite a brief history of its inspiration. Her voice, calm and crystalline, floated through the gallery like the last notes of a nocturne. Vermeer, she began, once said that light reveals not only form, but the soul within it. This final piece, she paused. A murmur spread among the guests as a soft click resonated through the gallery, like the distant snapping of a twig. The lights flickered. A technician in the back gave an embarrassed cough, but the moment passed, and the illumination steadied. Lady Artemisia resumed her speech, yet her eyes drifted for a fraction of a second, toward the corridor leading to the lower rooms, the one Edward Drayton had earlier attempted to draw her toward. Alain did not miss that faint, involuntary movement, nor did he miss the sudden appearance of Nicholas Vale, who slipped through the gallery doors with a harried expression, approached his aunt, and whispered something urgently into her ear. For the first time that evening, Lady Artemisia's mask of serenity cracked, only slightly. A tightening, a breath caught halfway, but enough for Allen to sense that the evening had reached its invisible hinge. "My friends," she said, her voice steady but thinner now, "if you will grant me a moment's indulgence, please continue to enjoy the gallery. Nicholas, see to the guests." With that, she stepped away from the crowd and disappeared down the corridor. Her departure was executed with decorum, yet it carried an undercurrent of haste that polite society pretended not to notice. Allen, however, was under no such obligation. He excused himself from a tedious conversation with Sir Lionel Treswick, whose monologue on military lighting strategies had reached heroic levels of pedantry and followed at a measured distance. He did not hurry. To hurry would have been to announce himself. Instead, he moved with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to shadows that whispered their secrets only when approached gently. The corridor beyond the gallery opened into a narrow stairwell leading down to the storage rooms. Cold, meticulously organized spaces where the gallery housed frames, crates, and the occasional forgotten curiosity. He descended softly. At the bottom, a faint pool of yellow light spilled from an open door. Lady Artemisia stood frozen at its threshold, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth. Nicholas hovered beside her, pale and rigid. Inside the room, Inspector Allen saw Edward Drayton. He lay on the floor beside a toppled crate, one arm crooked beneath him in an awkward angle, his head resting against the wheel of a trolley. His eyes were open, fixed on nothing. His expression, usually grave, was oddly peaceful, as though he had merely grown tired and decided to rest. But the stillness of death has a texture no sleep can mimic. Alain stepped forward. "Lady Artemisia," he said quietly, so as not to startle her, "if you will forgive me." She turned to him swiftly, her eyes wide. "Inspector, I had hoped. I did not wish to impose upon you in such a manner." "Circumstances," he murmured, kneeling beside the body, "have their own etiquette." He examined Drayton with practiced delicacy. No blood, No sign of struggle. The toppled crate suggested either a stumble or a staged effect, but Alain knew better than to trust appearances, particularly in rooms where objects were often rearranged by necessity. Nicholas shifted anxiously. He wasn't well earlier. I saw him leave the main hall. He looked ill. Lady Artemisia placed a trembling hand on the edge of the crate. He was to have checked the inventory tonight. The storage ledger, the frames, and... She stopped short. Alain lifted his gaze. And... The jewels, she whispered. Nicholas shot her a warning glance, but the words were already loose, like feathers escaping a cushion. The 20 miniature jewels embedded in the gilded frames, Lady Artemisia clarified, finding her composure with visible effort. A symbolic motif. There were 20. Each painting bore one. Alain's eyes flickered to the shelves, where empty, velvet-lined boxes sat askew. Where? He asked softly. Lady Artemisia swallowed. I had reason to believe one was missing earlier today. Now I fear more. Alain stood slowly. The air in the storage room carried a faint chill, like a draught no architect could account for. Edward Drayton lay with his hands relaxed, palms inward, the gesture of someone who had not braced himself. A quiet death, a quiet theft, a quiet catastrophe. Alain nodded gently to Lady Artemisia. I will examine the room thoroughly. For now, may I trouble you to return upstairs? The guests need not be alarmed before we understand what we are facing. She hesitated, then allowed Nicholas to guide her away. Alain remained in the room alone, and in the delicate stillness he felt the first unmistakable stirrings of a puzzle, one as precise and deceptive as the paintings themselves. Inspector Roderick Allen remained in the storage room long enough to let the initial shock settle, the quiet tick of a wall clock marking time in a rhythm unnervingly indifferent to human misfortune. He studied the scattered crates, the neat rows of frames, and the faint scuff marks in the worn wooden floor. Nothing screamed for attention, yet every detail demanded it, if one had the patience to observe. Allen's method was neither dramatic nor hurried. He did not shout, he did not gesture. He merely noticed. A fingertip brushed a crate corner, smooth, cold, but dusted unevenly, as if someone had recently disturbed it. A shadow from the open door played along the wall, revealing a small imprint in the polished floor, one that suggested someone had knelt or crouched. There was nothing violent here, nothing that suggested the ordinary chaos of robbery. The air smelled faintly of varnish and lilies, yet beneath that was something imperceptible, almost human, a trace of anxiety. He straightened and moved to the door. The corridor above was still open to the gallery, yet from the bustle below, no one seemed aware that Edward Drayton lay dead in the room beneath their feet. It was the sort of concealment elegance permits, a secret folded carefully into the fabric of social life. Alain ascended the stairs, each step measured, and paused in the gallery's outer hall. Guests continued to admire the paintings, some unaware, some politely oblivious. He observed their gestures, the way Sir Lionel Treswick adjusted his cuffs with the same precision he once applied to military strategy, the fluttering glances of Celia Brandt as she attempted to engage Jasper Herondale in conversation, only to be subtly dismissed. Nicholas Vale, standing near the door with a faint pallor, as if balancing the weight of knowledge he was not yet willing to share. He did not approach any immediately. To speak too soon would be to disturb the surface of manners, to draw attention to what might be a simple accident. He preferred the subtle art of observation, watching for tremors in posture, inflections in speech, the way hands brushed against objects. Each nuance carried information, much like a painter's brushstroke might betray an emotion beneath a subject's composed face. At the far end of the room, Lady Artemisia spoke quietly to a minor patron. Her hands were clasped, almost unnaturally, as if restraining a tremor. Her voice remained steady, But Alain noted the slight catch in her breath when Nicholas passed too near, and the flash of unease in her gaze toward the corridor leading below. Alain's eyes then fell upon another figure, an elderly matron, Mrs. Pembroke, who had served as Lady Artemisia's housekeeper for decades. She hovered near the refreshment table, glancing repeatedly toward the stairwell. Her expression, though polite, was tightly controlled. To an untrained observer, she was merely attentive. To Alain, she was withholding, calculating, and perfectly aware of something the others might not yet perceive. And then there was the matter of the paintings themselves. Alain's practiced eye noted their placement, the spacing between frames, the slight tilts in some, the imperceptible movement of shadows across the gilt edges. One painting, in particular, seemed to resonate with tension. Jewel 17, The Garnet Whisper. Its miniature figure stared not outward, but inward, an expression captured in oil that seemed almost alive with anticipation. Alain lingered a moment longer than he might have allowed in polite society, memorizing its contours, its framing, and the peculiar way it seemed to demand attention. He allowed a soft sigh to escape, partly of thought, partly to disguise the tension rising beneath his calm. He was never one to leap to conclusions, but instinct told him that tonight's event, elegant as it appeared, had fractured subtly. Something had intruded upon the routine of elegance, something that whispered in the spaces between laughter and compliment, between bow and handshake. The death below was not the end of a story. It was the hinge upon which the evening now turned. A quiet voice spoke beside him. "Inspector." Celia Brandt had approached, her expression tentative. I didn't mean to disturb." Alain offered a small nod, gentle but commanding. "Miss Brandt, your discretion is appreciated. For the moment, I observe, that is often more revealing than any questions." She tilted her head, curiosity mingled with unease. "Do you suspect something?" "Not yet," Alain replied softly. "But I have learned that suspicion is like a shadow. It does not move. It only grows." She nodded faintly, retreating to her circle of acquaintances. Alain's gaze returned to the guests and the paintings alike. He did not need to speak to uncover motive. He simply watched, and in watching, the first quiet lines of a story began to emerge. Lines not drawn by evidence alone, but by human behavior under pressure, the subtle fractures of civility that often betrayed the truest intentions. And so, amidst laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the superficial calm of polite society, Inspector Allen continued to observe, the stillness of the room a perfect canvas upon which the darker story would slowly, inevitably, reveal itself. Inspector Allen's approach was never confrontational. Politeness, he had discovered, was often more compelling than insistence, and within the delicate lattice of high society, it was frequently the only key to the truth. He began with the guests nearest to the corridor, those whose proximity to the storage rooms might have rendered them privy to Drayton's last movements. Sir Lionel Treswick, the retired general, was the first. He had taken a chair at the edge of the gallery, near a cluster of minor patrons. Alain approached, bowing slightly in acknowledgement. "Sir Lionel," he began, voice soft, unobtrusive, "may I trouble you for a moment regarding the evening?" "Of course, Inspector," the general replied, straightening his back with military precision, "though I fear I have little to offer save admiration for Lady Artemisia's curation." Alain inclined his head. "And yet, might you recall if you saw Mr. Drayton at any point after the exhibition commenced?" Treswick paused, a shadow of irritation crossing his face. "I saw him near the ledger, yes, but one rarely observes the minutiae of staff movements. They are, after all, expected to perform their duties without requiring commentary from the rest of us." A small, deliberate choice of words. Staff, not servant. Duties, not responsibilities. Alain noted the distinction. Treswick's discomfort was visible in the tightening of his fingers around the arm of the chair. It was not guilt, He was a man of public duty, not private intrigue, but it betrayed a man unused to acknowledging the vulnerabilities of those beneath his social rank. Next, Alain approached Celia Brandt, the young actress. She was reclining on a chaise near a window, the pale winter light giving her hair the appearance of spun gold. Her fingers toyed nervously with a folded program. "Miss Brandt," Alain said gently, "have you observed anything unusual this evening? Even a small detail can be of significance." Her lips pressed together. "Unusual," she repeated, her voice light. Well, everyone seems so polite, so composed. But, Inspector, perhaps the gallery itself is unusual. So many passages and hidden rooms. One never knows who might slip unnoticed." Alain allowed the observation to settle. The indirectness was revealing. She had noticed something but avoided specifying, as though instinct warned her against articulating suspicion in the presence of others. He made a mental note of her attentiveness, the subtle tremor in her hands, and the hesitation in her speech. He then sought Nicholas Vale, who hovered anxiously near the punch table. The young man's discomfort was almost tangible, a faint pallor mingled with restless gestures. "Nicholas," Alain said, lowering his voice, "it is not my purpose to startle, only to understand. Mr. Drayton's sudden passing. Did you see him before he collapsed?" Nicholas shifted. I escorted my aunt briefly. Then he said he would check the lower rooms. That was the last I saw him." "And you did not hear or see anything else unusual?" Alain asked, his tone even, inviting but insistent. "No, nothing," Nicholas murmured. Yet his eyes flickered toward the corridor. A minor tremor betrayed him. Not deceitful, but the reluctance to reveal what he feared might seem trivial. Alain caught it instantly. Finally, Alain observed Lady Artemisia from a distance as she conversed with Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper. Their exchange was muted, but he noted the slight tension in the older woman's posture, the way her hands flexed at her sides. Not panic, but awareness. A knowledge held carefully, without malice, and without readiness to disclose. Alain's experience suggested that in households such as this, the servants were often repositories of truth, guardians of events better left unspoken until the proper hour. Alain paused. In these discreet interviews, in the subtle evasion of direct answers, he discerned the first faint pattern. Each individual held fragments of awareness, fragments tempered by social caution, personal pride, or fear of impropriety. The puzzle was beginning to form, not in evidence alone, but in the social fabric itself. The silences, the indirect replies, the gestures that conveyed more than speech. He allowed the thought to settle, and, without pressing further, returned his attention to the gallery. The guests remained, their laughter soft, their compliments perfunctory, yet beneath it all a faint unease flickered. The veneer of civility was intact, but it trembled subtly, like glass struck lightly at the edge. Alain knew, with a quiet certainty, that the evening's first fracture, Edward Drayton's death, was only the beginning. In polite society, disasters arrived in whispers and glances, not shouts, and it was often the smallest gesture that betrayed the largest truths. And as he moved through the room, observing rather than speaking, he felt the invisible web tighten, promising that the next revelation would not come from accident or intuition alone, but from the careful unraveling of the evening's subtle dissonances. Inspector Allen turned his attention now to those whose presence was quieter but no less significant, the gallery's servants. In households of refined taste and careful routines, it was often the attendants, the butler, the housekeeper, the occasional aide, who witnessed everything, understood more than they spoke, and mastered the delicate art of silence. Edward Drayton's demise had unsettled them, yet not entirely. Alain noticed small, almost imperceptible gestures, her hand lingering on a railing, eyes darting briefly toward the corridor below, a cough stifled behind a gloved hand. These were not signs of panic. They were expressions of discretion, of knowledge weighed against the consequences of revelation. Alain approached Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, who now hovered near the base of the gallery staircase. Her hands were folded tightly before her, fingers clasped in a subtle mimicry of Lady Artemisia's posture. Though polite, her posture betrayed tension, a learned form of restraint that suggested she knew more than she would admit. "Mrs. Pembroke," Alain began, his voice a soft and unobtrusive note within the ambient murmur of the gallery. "Might I have a word regarding Mr. Drayton?" She inclined her head with perfect civility, the smallest hint of resignation in her eyes. "Of course, Inspector. I'm happy to assist, though I fear my knowledge may be of little use." Alain did not rush her. Silence was often a more effective interrogative than questions. He watched the brief flutter of her lashes, the almost imperceptible shift in weight from one foot to the other. It was the way a woman accustomed to service responded when confronted with information that might disturb the careful order of her household. "Mrs. Pembroke," Alain continued, "did Mr. Drayton behave unusually today? Any action out of routine? Any hesitation in his duties?" "Sir." The housekeeper's lips pressed together. Her eyes flickered toward the corridor, then back to Alain. He was uneasy this evening. I noticed it. He moved differently, spoke less, but I did not wish to interfere with his tasks, nor did I wish to alarm Lady Artemisia." Her restraint was deliberate, practiced. Alain understood that her silence was not born of deceit, but of propriety. In her world, knowledge carried obligation, yet obligation demanded discretion. There was something unspoken, a fragment of observation Drayton had shared, or perhaps discovered himself. She withheld it, perhaps not entirely consciously, aware that revelation might disturb the carefully balanced social order. "And the storage rooms?" Alain asked gently. "Did you notice anything amiss there?" Mrs. Pembroke's fingers twitched ever so slightly. "The ledgers, some frames. They were checked as usual. Yet She paused, swallowed, then said, "I did notice Edward linger near a crate he did not usually touch, but I assumed perhaps he merely sought to ensure the collection was complete." Alain inclined his head, noting the careful selection of words. "And no one else observed this?" Not that I am aware. The guests rarely venture below." He allowed the moment to pass, letting her discomfort and the subtle tremor in her voice settle like dust. The most telling disclosures, he knew, often arrived not in spoken confession but in hesitation, the pause before resuming civility. Next, he considered the other attendants, a waiter moving swiftly between groups, a young maid adjusting the drapery, all maintaining an unobtrusive presence. Each carried a fraction of understanding. Perhaps the way Drayton had received an unusual visitor, or the manner in which a crate had been shifted before his death. But none spoke, not yet, and it was clear they would do so only when pressed or when the proper time arrived. Alain's mind, always alert to nuance, catalogued the fragments of information like brushstrokes on a canvas. The servant's reluctance was not obstruction. It was the preservation of social equilibrium, a delicate dance that balanced loyalty, discretion, and fear. To compel them prematurely would risk silence hardened into stone. He stood in the gallery's quiet corner, observing. Mrs. Pembroke returned to her post, her hands steady but her eyes betraying a careful awareness. Edward Drayton's death had created a subtle tremor, one that was already rippling through the household, through the guests, through the carefully curated surfaces of politeness. Alain understood the pattern forming. The servant's silence was not merely a social courtesy, it was a repository of truth. And in their restraint, he would find the keys to questions not yet asked. In moments to come, when the shadows of the night deepened, these silent witnesses would reveal more than they intended, perhaps more than they realized. For now, he waited, patient, watching the interplay of observation, silence, and propriety. In polite society, as he had often discovered, the truth did not announce itself. It whispered in gestures, lingered in hesitations, and waited quietly until the proper mind, keen and unhurried, chose to listen. Alayan's eyes, calm and discerning, returned to the assembly above. The gallery continued its polite hum. Guests admired the paintings. Laughter punctuated the quiet clinking of glasses. And yet, beneath it all, the servants held the first threads of the story. Threads that, if followed with care, would unravel the mystery lying in wait. Inspector Alin lingered in the gallery's soft light, considering the patterns of the evening. He had observed the guests, the servants, and even the manner in which Lady Artemisia navigated the room. But something told him that the truth lay not in words spoken or withheld, but in what had been habitual, now subtly disturbed. His attention returned to the storage rooms below. There, amidst crates and ledgers, the absence of Edward Drayton had revealed more than the mere finality of death. It had revealed rupture, a break in the carefully maintained order of routine, one that only someone intimately acquainted with the gallery's inner workings could discern. Alayan retraced the path he had taken moments earlier. His trained eyes sought minutiae, a footprint slightly misaligned with the floorboard's polished grain, a crate pushed back imperfectly, a ledger opened and then closed with evidence of hurried use. These were not glaring signs, yet in a world governed by ritual, they were loud. The gallery's attendants moved according to well-rehearsed patterns. The same step, the same motion, the same attention to detail. A deviation, however slight, spoke volumes. He crouched beside a small velvet-lined box, one of the 20 once containing miniature jewels. It was empty, yet the velvet bore the faint impression of a tiny, irregular shape, a last touch, perhaps, left behind in haste. Alayan allowed his gloved hand to hover above it, not touching, merely registering the subtle dent. It was a signature of behavior, the hurried concealment of an object imperfectly executed, betraying the presence of someone unaccustomed to doing such things under observation. Above him, the distant hum of polite conversation continued. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the careful circulation of guests. Each sound a layer of normalcy, masking the irregularities below. Alayan felt the quiet pull of understanding. The missing jewels were not the product of a random act, but of intention, the disruption of habit itself. He rose and inspected the crate that had toppled beside Edward Drayton's body. Its position suggested not an accident, but a careful maneuver to access its contents. The hinges bore the faintest scrape marks, almost invisible, that indicated repeated opening and closing. Alayan noted these, cataloguing them alongside the impressions in the velvet box. There was, too, a subtle pattern in Drayton's personal movements. Alayan had observed him pacing the corridor before his death, returning several times to the same crate, adjusting its alignment, checking its contents with meticulous precision. Such repetition was ritualistic, habitual, yet the night's events had interrupted it. Alayan imagined Drayton's last actions, the final adjustment of a frame, the brief glance over his shoulder, the quiet acknowledgement that something was awry. He considered Lady Artemisia's approach. Her manner had been composed, but only slightly. She had lingered near the corridor, her fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes darting to Nicholas and then to the doorway. Alan had seen her anticipate Drayton's next move, as though she too recognized the importance of ritual, the danger of its disruption. Then, as he examined the ledger resting upon a nearby crate, a subtle irregularity caught his attention. The entries were precise, dated, signed, each motion a testament to order. Except for one, a faint smudge, a line slightly out of place, a date that had been overwritten with careful erasure. To most, it would seem insignificant. To Alan, it was a message hidden within the ordinary, a disturbance in routine signaling an act of intervention. Alan's mind, ever attentive to the human element behind the inanimate, began to trace possibilities. The jewels had been moved, yes, but by whom? Someone aware of Drayton's habits, someone attuned to the sequence of checks and adjustments, someone willing to exploit the smallest deviation to conceal intent. The clue lay not in the object itself, but in the pattern broken, the ritual interrupted. He allowed a slow breath. The gallery above remained untroubled, the social performance uninterrupted. Laughter and light conversation, the soft rustle of skirts and the faint brush of shoes across polished floors. And beneath it, the quiet room below held the echo of broken habits, the faint trace of human error, and the subtle signature of deliberate action. Alain straightened, eyes sweeping over the storage room one final time. In this universe of elegance and ritual, the missing jewels had revealed their first secret. The individual who had taken them had acted not in haste, but with careful attention to what was expected, what was habitual, and what could be disturbed without immediate notice. And in that deliberate disruption, the first faint outline of motive, and perhaps of culprit, began to emerge. By the time Inspector Alain returned to the gallery, the social performance above had resumed in near-perfect cadence. Laughter floated in soft arcs over the polished floor. Glasses clinked delicately, and Lady Artemisia once more appeared composed, her fingers now lightly touching the rims of her glass as she conversed with an elderly collector. Yet beneath this carefully maintained veneer, a subtle tremor persisted, barely perceptible, and Alain noted it with quiet attention. He did not speak immediately. Observation first, the patient, unhurried gathering of details that others overlooked. And then he noticed it, the absence of one particular guest from her usual place, the slender space where Jasper Herondale, the painter, had been entertaining the young debutantes with quiet banter. He should have been near the far side of the gallery, adjusting the light to catch the reflections on the gilded frames. Yet he was gone. A minor absence, one that might escape notice. But Alain recognized the significance of these small fractures in expected behavior. Nicholas Vale, standing nervously near the refreshments, whispered to Lady Artemisia, his voice too low for casual observation. She smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed concern. Alain's gaze followed them, noting the tension in her posture, the subtle way her hand hovered over her chest, as if restraining both breath and thought. The interaction was brief, yet charged with unspoken urgency. A small ripple atop the evening's quiet surface. And then came the second incident. A letter, hastily discovered, tucked beneath a chair in the gallery's reading alcove. It had clearly been displaced, not forgotten. Alain retrieved it, careful not to disturb the delicate curl of the paper. The handwriting was elegant, cursive, each stroke deliberate, yet the words carried an unfamiliar urgency. A note of warning, perhaps, though addressed to no one in particular, signed only with initials. A minor event to the casual observer, but Alain discerned in it the same signature of disturbance he had noted in the storage room. Ritual interrupted, routine challenged, the invisible threads of order frayed. He returned the letter discreetly to its place, his eyes scanning the room as he did so. Guests continued their measured exploration of the paintings, oblivious to the small dramas unfolding beyond the surface. A faint cough echoed from the alcove, and Alain glimpsed Mrs. Pembroke, observing the gallery with quiet vigilance, her hands folded before her as though she carried the weight of the household secrets in her posture alone. A sudden movement drew his attention. Celia Brandt, the young actress, had stepped back from the crowd, her eyes fixed on a frame slightly askew. She hesitated, fingers brushing lightly against her necklace, then turned sharply as though startled by her own realization. Alain noted the moment without comment. Such gestures, though fleeting, often revealed more than prolonged declarations. The quiet awareness, the almost imperceptible startle. These were signs of insight, suspicion, or recollection. Meanwhile, Lady Artemisia had approached Sir Lionel Treswick, engaging him in conversation that appeared entirely casual. Yet Alan's practiced eye observed the way her voice lowered slightly, the tilt of her head, the way she subtly positioned herself between Treswick and the corridor. There was an unspoken negotiation taking place, a balancing act between revelation and concealment. The gallery's elegance masked the tension beneath, but Alan read it as clearly as any ledger or ledger's smudge. And then, faintly, a whisper of movement from the servants' corridor. Aline's gaze shifted. One of the young attendants, a boy responsible for adjusting lighting, paused mid-step, glanced back toward the storage room, and then continued as though nothing had occurred. The action was subtle, but to Aline, whose attention was attuned to the deviations of habitual behavior, it spoke volumes. A second stirring in a night already unsettled, a quiet collapse beneath the veneer of composure. He allowed himself a brief assessment. The death of Edward Drayton had fractured the evening, introducing subtle tension into an otherwise precise social performance. The missing jewels had introduced another disturbance, quietly undermining the familiar rhythms of the gallery. And now, with the misplaced letter, the absent painter, and the servant's furtive movements, the ripples multiplied, intersecting and reinforcing one another, creating a pattern that demanded careful analysis. Alan inhaled softly, as though drawing the evening's tensions into a single, coherent perception. The night was still young, and yet the puzzle had begun to extend beyond the storage room, reaching into the lives and gestures of every participant. This second stirring, the small, quiet collapses of expectation and habit, was a reminder that in high society, as in life itself, the smallest deviations often held the deepest truths. He stood, composed, unhurried, and allowed the gallery's soft hum to wash over him once more. The veneer of civility remained, yet beneath it, he knew, the story had begun to write itself, and he would watch patiently as it continued to unfold. By the time the gallery's evening was drawing toward its measured conclusion, Inspector Allen had taken a quiet seat near the central display, allowing the ebb and flow of polite conversation to continue around him. The guests, their curiosity and unease veiled beneath the practiced mask of civility, were unaware of the patterns he had begun to discern, the subtle discrepancies that marked the night's fracture. Alain's mind, ever patient, began to piece these fragments together with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to reading the invisible script of human behavior. He reflected first upon the actions of Edward Drayton. The caretaker's last movements had been deliberate, habitual. The repetition of checks, the careful adjustments of frames, the meticulous notation of the ledgers. The very precision of his ritual suggested an individual who took both pride and security in order. Yet it was precisely this meticulousness that had made him vulnerable. The slightest disturbance, the smallest deviation, had been enough to unbalance him. Alain could imagine Drayton pausing mid-task, sensing an irregularity that he could neither name nor counteract, and the quiet fatality that followed. Alain's attention then shifted to the guests. Nicholas Vale, despite his youth, carried a tension in his movements, a weight of knowledge constrained by filial loyalty and social expectation. Celia Brandt, observant though deferential, had noted something in the gallery's alignment, a disturbance that hinted at awareness beyond what she had been permitted to articulate. Sir Lionel Treswick, imposing and disciplined, remained courteous yet subtly self-conscious, adjusting his gestures as if to maintain the equilibrium of appearances. And Lady Artemisia herself, poised as always, exhibited the faintest tremor in moments of indirect interaction, a delicate sign that she too had perceived the fissures in her household's ritual. Alan reflected too on the servants. Mrs. Pembroke, by no means unshakable, had held back what she knew, her restraint indicative of respect, propriety, and perhaps fear. Not of law, but of social consequence. The young attendant who paused near the corridor had betrayed, in a single hesitation, a consciousness of something larger than his immediate task. It was these silences, these hesitations, that Alain trusted more than any spoken confession. They were the language of truth beneath the veneer of etiquette. And then there were the jewels, the empty boxes, the faint impressions left in velvet, the disrupted crate, each an indicator of intention rather than accident. Their removal was precise, careful, deliberate, yet executed in a manner calculated to exploit human routine and expectation. Alain could sense the hand behind this act, patient, observant, and intimately acquainted with both the household schedule and the behavioral patterns of those within it. He allowed himself a moment to draw these threads together. The evening, in its polite orchestration, had been disrupted in multiple ways, by death, by theft, by small deviations in habitual behavior. Yet the disruption itself formed a discernible pattern, one that could be read by a mind attuned to the subtleties of psychology and social ritual. Alain's intuition, that quiet and measured faculty honed over years of practice, began to settle like dust upon these threads. The picture that emerged was not of chaos, but of deliberate orchestration. The interplay of human behavior, the strategic placement of observation and absence, the exploitation of ritual for personal ends. It was not the evidence alone, not the footprints, the smudges, or the misaligned frames, but the orchestration of human responses to these details that marked the mind behind the act. He observed the room once more, noting the precise angles of the paintings, the faint tremor in Lady Artemisia's hands as she adjusted a frame, the nervous glance of Nicholas Vale, the rigid composure of Treswick. Each gesture reinforced the emerging narrative, careful, deliberate, psychologically coherent. Alain felt the puzzle coalesce in the quiet spaces between speech and action. The evening continued around him, its surface unmarred by revelation. Laughter, polite applause, and measured discussion of art filled the room. Yet beneath it, the truth had already begun to assert itself, like the first faint light of dawn slipping through a lattice of shadows. Alain's mind, patient and precise, was attuned to its subtle contours. And in that quiet, composed observation, he understood that the resolution of the evening would not be abrupt or theatrical. It would arrive, as all truths eventually do, through the careful unfolding of human nature, measured gestures, and the inevitable exposure of what had been hidden beneath civility and ritual. Alain leaned back slightly, allowing a faint smile, imperceptible to any observer, to touch his lips. The pattern was forming, the story, previously obscured in silence and hesitation, was beginning to speak, and all he needed to do was listen. Inspector Alain allowed the evening to progress with careful patience, observing the interplay of guests and staff as one might trace the flight of a bird across a quiet sky. The polite laughter, the subdued murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses. All these were threads of routine, yet each bore subtle irregularities, fractures invisible to the casual eye. He had gathered them silently, stored them in his mind, and now sensed the precise moment at which to act. It was Lady Artemisia who, with an elegant yet faintly anxious gesture, stepped toward the corridor once more. Alain followed at a discreet distance, his own movements measured and unobtrusive. The corridor was empty, save for the soft echo of their footsteps upon polished wood. Here, at last, the evening's quiet storm could be addressed without the intrusion of polite society or its accompanying pretenses. "Lady Artemisia," he said softly, bowing his head in acknowledgement, "may I speak with you for a moment regarding the events of this evening?" She inclined her head, a subtle surrender to authority tempered by trust. "Of course, Inspector, I have been most anxious to understand what has occurred." They walked together, the silence between them unpressured but pointed. Alain's mind reviewed the evening, the missing jewels, the carefully preserved routines, the small hesitations, and the unnoticed gestures that had betrayed more than words ever could. He had observed, as he always did, more than he had yet chosen to question, and now he was ready to translate these observations into understanding. "Lady Artemisia," he began, voice low and deliberate, "the death of Mr. Drayton was unfortunate. Yet I believe it is merely the opening of a larger pattern. A disturbance has taken place, subtle but deliberate. The removal of the jewels, the minor irregularities in routine, the hesitations of those around you. Each is a stroke in a carefully composed tableau." Her hands trembled ever so slightly, pressed together at her waist. "You mean it was not an accident? That someone intended to disrupt the evening?" Alain inclined his head, eyes calm and precise. "Indeed. And the individual responsible is acutely aware of the structure of your household, your routines, and the predictable behaviors of those who reside within it. It is someone who understands ritual and exploits it, confident that subtlety will conceal intent." Lady Artemisia's lips parted slightly, her composure fracturing in a manner most elegant. A measured intake of breath, the faintest tilt of the head. "But who? Surely it cannot be anyone in this assembly." Alain regarded her thoughtfully. "That is precisely what they rely upon, confidence in the surface of civility. But observation has its own verdict. I have noted gestures, small deviations from habit, hesitations that speak louder than declarations." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Miss Brant, Mr. Vale, Sir Lionel, all have contributed unwittingly to the revelation of truth by their ordinary behaviors. And the servants, through the restraint of their knowledge, have provided the final outline. Only one person could have orchestrated these actions with the subtlety necessary to achieve this result." Lady Artemisia's eyes widened, yet she remained poised. "You do not speak to accuse in haste, Inspector." "Never," Alain replied, his tone gentle yet resolute. "We do not need spectacle. The truth will unfold quietly, and that is how it should be, with civility and without unnecessary alarm. It is the very elegance of the situation that permits resolution." She exhaled, a faint sigh of resignation mingled with relief. "And you believe that it will be resolved tonight?" Alain's eyes, clear and deliberate, met hers. "It will be. There is no need for dramatics. The individual will recognize, as I have, that the pattern is discernible, the inconsistencies too precise to ignore. They will understand that discovery is inevitable." Lady Artemisia inclined her head, her hands unclasped now to rest lightly at her sides. Alain's quiet authority, his mastery of observation and subtle persuasion, had guided her to acceptance rather than fear. The calm was restored not by the absence of tension, but by the knowledge that its source was understood and that its resolution had begun. Together, they returned to the gallery. The guests continued their polite exploration of the paintings, unaware that a quiet reckoning was underway. The social equilibrium had not been shattered. It had been gently, imperceptibly, nudged toward revelation. Alain's presence, measured and composed, ensured that civility would remain intact even as the truth approached. And in that careful, understated return, the first steps of confrontation had been taken, silent, elegant, and inevitable. The gallery, bathed in the soft glow of late evening lamplight, seemed unaware of the delicate drama that had unfolded beneath its surface. Inspector Ellin, ever composed, had guided Lady Artemisia to a position near the central display, subtly positioning the moment for revelation without spectacle. Civility, he knew, was often the most potent instrument in extracting truth. Alan spoke first, his voice low and measured, drawing the attention of those nearest without alarm. The events of this evening, the death of Mr. Drayton, the removal of the jewels, the subtle disruptions in routine, are not merely coincidental. They are interconnected, a narrative constructed through intention and awareness of human behavior. The guests nearby stirred slightly, curiosity piqued by the calm authority of his tone. No panic, no raised voices, merely a ripple of attention across the gallery's surface. And the individual responsible, Alain continued, is not one who acts blindly, nor one unfamiliar with the habits of those around them. They relied upon the predictability of routine, upon civility itself, to conceal their actions. Yet the deviations, however small, betrayed them. Alain's gaze, steady and precise, swept the room before settling upon Lady Artemisia. She inclined her head as though acknowledging the weight of what he implied. "Inspector," she said softly, "you speak as if the truth is certain." "It is," Alain replied, his tone gentle, "not by guesswork, but by observation. The jewels were removed with intent, yes, but the act itself was secondary. More revealing was the way individuals reacted. The hesitations, the unspoken acknowledgements, the brief tremors in posture. These formed a constellation, and in that constellation, the culprit is unmistakable." A subtle murmur passed through the few who had drawn close, though none dared to speak aloud. Alain allowed a slight pause, giving the weight of anticipation its proper space, then continued. "Miss Brant, Mr. Vale, Sir Lionel, all have been observed, not for suspicion, but for clarity. Their behavior, combined with the insights of those who serve, has guided this conclusion." He shifted his eyes to Nicholas Vale. The young man, already pale from anxiety, stiffened. Alain's observation was quiet, unhurried, yet penetrating. "Mr. Vale," Alain said softly, "you have been conscious of more than you revealed, not through malice, but through the natural desire to preserve decorum. That restraint, admirable as it is, has nonetheless illuminated the truth." Nicholas swallowed, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. Alain's gaze moved then to Celia Brant, whose subtle startles and attentive glances had likewise betrayed awareness beyond the ordinary. "And the removal of the jewels," Alain continued, "was conducted by one who understood these behaviors perfectly. The individual who acted knew the household's routine, anticipated the reactions of guests and servants alike, and sought to exploit civility to obscure intent. Yet, in the end, it was civility itself. The careful observation, the attention to minor gestures, that has revealed them." There was a brief, tense silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet on polished floors. Alain's voice remained calm, unhurried, but every word carried the weight of quiet inevitability. He allowed the glance to linger on Lady Artemisia, whose eyes reflected understanding tempered by the faintest admixture of dread. The truth had arrived, not with violence or spectacle, but with elegance and precision, as the story had been constructed from the very behaviors it had sought to manipulate. "And so," Alain said finally, "the pattern is clear. The jewels were taken not in haste, but with deliberate calculation. The death of Mr. Drayton, though tragic, was the catalyst, the subtle disruption that revealed the threads of intention. The individual responsible will, I trust, recognize the clarity with which their actions have been observed and respond accordingly." A small cough from Mrs. Pembroke, almost imperceptible, signaled her awareness, her careful restraint having borne witness to the unfolding truth. The servants, though silent, had provided the final strokes in this quiet, elegant revelation. Alain paused, allowing the moment to settle like a soft shadow across the gallery. The guests, the servants, and Lady Artemisia herself understood, not through drama, but through the subtle, inescapable logic of observation. The story had unfolded with civility and tact, with no raised voices or forced confession, yet with the inevitability of a truth finally recognized. And in that quiet, carefully measured acknowledgement, the evening's mysteries, death, disappearance, and human frailty, had begun to resolve themselves, gently, inevitably, and with the composed dignity that Inspector Allen had always prized. The gallery had returned to its semblance of order, though Allen knew that beneath the calm surface, subtle tremors lingered. Civility, after all, could mask disquiet only so long. The truth had been observed, revealed, yet its consequences remained to unfold. Justice, in this refined world, was less a matter of spectacle than of inevitability. Alain stood near the central display, where the missing jewels had now been returned to their velvet-lined cases. The restoration of physical order was simple, almost trivial, compared to the restoration, or disruption, of social equilibrium. Those who had witnessed the subtle unveiling of the culprit's hand now navigated the room with measured steps, their expressions composed, yet tinged with the quiet recognition of moral consequence. Lady Artemisia approached, her composure restored, though a shadow lingered in her eyes. "Inspector," she said softly, "it seems that the matter is concluded, and yet I cannot help but feel the weight of what has transpired. The individual responsible, what will become of them?" Alain regarded her calmly, aware that the question was not merely about legal consequence, but the interplay of character, social expectation, and the quiet judgments of the household. "In this instance," he replied, "justice is both straightforward and subtle. The culprit will answer in the manner required by law, yes, yet they will also answer to the unavoidable judgments of conscience and social awareness. That, perhaps, is the greater reckoning." Across the room, Nicholas Vale's posture reflected relief tempered by unease. The revelation had been neither shouted nor dramatized, yet the weight of discovery settled firmly upon him. Alain noted the faint slump of his shoulders, the way his gaze fell to the floor for a heartbeat longer than etiquette might allow. It was the quiet surrender that followed recognition, acknowledgement without protest, acceptance without display. Celia Brandt, the young actress, observed the interactions with keen attentiveness, her eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and comprehension. She had witnessed subtle power, moral consequence, and the unspoken interplay of social restraint. Ellen, noting her expression, recognized that the lessons of the evening, observation, patience, propriety, had been indelibly impressed upon her understanding of human behavior. Sir Lionel Treswick, the retired general, maintained a disciplined posture, yet even he betrayed the smallest sign of inward reflection. A hand tightened ever so slightly around a champagne flute, a measured pause before speaking in polite reply to Lady Artemisia. Alain observed that even the most controlled exterior could not entirely shield a man from the implications of knowledge, from the weight of truth that bore no malice yet carried consequence. And then, the culprit, whose actions had been revealed not through confession, but through the inevitability of pattern and observation, stood quietly, acknowledging the truth with the decorum that high society demanded. There was no need for raised voices or dramatic denouement. The recognition itself sufficed. Responsibility had been made evident, both to themselves and to those whose observations had guided Alain to this conclusion. Alain's own presence, measured and unobtrusive, underscored the elegance of resolution. He did not need to speak further, for the act of revelation had spoken for itself. The missing jewels were returned, the disruption accounted for, and the moral consequences understood. Justice had been served, not with flourish or denunciation, but with quiet inevitability. The servants, too, resumed their discreet roles, their silence now informed by awareness rather than ignorance. Mrs. Pembroke, for instance, continued her careful observation, her hands folded, her posture composed, yet tempered by the knowledge that she had been an unintentional witness to the evening's subtle drama. The household would function as before, but with the imprint of truth embedded in its routine, like a watermark visible only to those who looked closely. Alain allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, unremarkable yet profound. The equilibrium, though gently disturbed, would restore itself. The social order, fragile yet resilient, would continue, guided by civility, restrained observation, and the quiet inevitability of recognition. The evening's lessons, subtle and layered, would resonate beyond the immediate resolution, a testament to the precision of human behavior under scrutiny. He glanced across the gallery once more, eyes sweeping the assembled company. Civility had endured, justice had been imparted, and yet, in the quiet recognition of consequence, there lingered the faintest irony, that in the pursuit of elegance and order, the most revealing truths are those observed in silence, gestures, and the smallest departures from habit. The gallery had settled into a quiet postlude, its lamps casting a mellow glow upon the polished floors, gilded frames, and the now restored cases of jewels. Guests had departed in orderly fashion, murmuring courteous farewells and exchanging the measured civility that the evening demanded. Lady Artemisia remained, standing near the central display, her hands lightly clasped, eyes thoughtful. Even in the absence of urgency, the weight of recent events lingered in the space between walls, floors, and portraits. Inspector Allen, having ensured that the household was stabilized and that the authorities would follow proper procedure regarding the culprit, took a final, deliberate walk through the gallery. He did not hurry, nor did he seek applause or acknowledgement. His steps were quiet, his mind reflecting upon the subtle narrative that had unfolded, the delicate threads of human behavior that had, with precision, guided him to truth. He paused before a painting of a quiet landscape, the brush strokes depicting a mist-laden morning that seemed to mirror the subdued tension that had characterized the evening. In the stillness, he contemplated the interplay of order and disruption, of habit and its occasional betrayal. The jewels, though material in nature, had been a symbol, an object of desire, yes, but also a marker of routine, observation, and human foibles. Edward Drayton's death had been the catalyst, but not the story's center. The story, Alain reflected, had been composed in gestures, pauses, and silences. The faint tremor of a hand, a misaligned crate, a hesitation in speech. These had been the language through which truth spoke. And in that language he had discerned intention, awareness, and ultimately, accountability. It was a quiet triumph, devoid of spectacle, yet complete in its revelation. Lady Artemisia approached, her expression softened by relief and contemplation. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle, "I cannot help but feel the evening has changed something in us all, even those who did nothing wrong. The subtleties of what we saw, they linger." Alain nodded, his calm presence a reassurance. "Indeed, Lady Artemisia, in households such as yours, with structure so carefully maintained, even the smallest fracture reveals much. Not merely of objects or possessions, but of character itself. That is where the true understanding lies." Her gaze shifted toward the returned jewels, the cases glinting softly in the light. "And yet," she said after a pause, "all is returned. Civility endures. Is that not enough?" "Civility," Alain replied, "endures not because nothing is disturbed, but because understanding and acknowledgement follow disruption. The evening's events have revealed the fragility, and the resilience of human order. That duality, the lesson, if one may call it so, is perhaps the most enduring jewel of all. He walked to the corridor that had concealed the initial disturbances, noting how the shadows now lay perfectly aligned, unbroken. In that symmetry, Alan saw both literal and symbolic resolution. The pattern had been disturbed, observed, and restored, each step deliberate, each revelation quiet, yet exacting in consequence. The servants, too, had resumed their careful routines, the hush of their movement a testament to discretion and prudence. Mrs. Pembroke had returned to her post near the staircase, hands folded, eyes attentive. Elaine had seen, in her quiet observation, the acknowledgement that the household's invisible structures had been maintained even through breach. Knowledge, when restrained and respected, had proved as decisive as any law. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, looking once more at the gallery as it lay in calm aftermath. The events of the evening, death, theft, deception, and revelation, had been rendered with subtlety, yet their impact would echo in memory and conduct. Civility, propriety, and observation had not merely preserved order. They had illuminated truth. Alain straightened, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, his expression composed, detached yet thoughtful. The gallery's lamps glowed faintly in acknowledgement of a night that had been both ordinary and extraordinary, a night where human nature, in its delicate complexity, had spoken in whispers, pauses, and gestures. And he, patient and perceptive, had listened. As he prepared to leave, he cast one last glance over the room. The jewels gleamed quietly, the guests' impressions lingered faintly in memory, and the shadows settled into place. In that stillness, he understood, as always, that elegance, even in the presence of crime, was as much about perception as reality, and that the most revealing truths often required neither spectacle nor proclamation, only attentive observation and quiet reflection. Alain stepped toward the doorway, his figure merging with the evening's lingering calm. The gallery, restored yet subtly marked by what had passed, remained behind him, a testament to civility, human complexity, and the gentle, inevitable triumph of reason over circumstance. He paused at the threshold, casting one last serene glance. In the delicate equilibrium of the gallery, amidst shadows, reflections, and the soft gleam of recovered jewels, he allowed himself a single, quiet thought. Even in the most civilized of worlds, the smallest deviations speak the loudest truths. And with that, he departed, leaving the gallery to its stillness and its secrets, the night settling gently around it like a silken veil.